But I just want to welcome you and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Joanne. Oh yeah, my name is April McGill. I am a San Francisco State alum. That's the first thing I will say. It's most important. I'm also a member of Round Valley Indian Tribes. I'm Yuki, Little Lake, Pomo, Wailaki, and Wappo on my dad's side. I'm the Director of Community Partnerships and Projects at the California Consortium for Urban Indian Health here in San Francisco, which we also call SACUI. So I'm happy to be here and talk to you about our Red Women Rising project.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michelle Maas. I am Ojibwe from the Great Lakes, from Great Cliff Reservation, and a descendant of the Bad River Reservation. I'm a first-year relocatee. My mother came out here to relocate during World War II, and I guess that makes me the first native thing in my family. And I'm happy to be here today. Thank you for the invitation.
Hi everyone, I'm Jackie Fawn. I'm from the Yurok tribe in Northern California, from the Clamacres, and I do a lot of art with April for SACUI. I'm their artist in residence and an artist in residence with the Greenpeace warehouse in Oakland. So it's really cool to be here. So thank you for having me.
So for today's presentation, I wanted to share with you around our Red Women Rising project, and all three of us worked really closely together. Michelle and I worked for the Native American Health Center. So we worked with a lot of Native families and youth and children here in San Francisco. And so we work really closely together, and we do a lot of work around domestic violence and missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so I just want to share with you the SACUI project, and then Michelle's going to share some of her work that she does around trauma, and Jackie's going to speak about the images that she's created around the NMIW work for SACUI. And then Bernadette Smith was not able to make it today. She is actually, it was her birthday, and she wanted to, that wasn't the thing when she kind of said, it's my birthday, and the children are being very attached to her, because she was going to share her story about her sister Nicole, and how her sister was murdered a couple of years ago, and so she wanted to share her story. And it's very sensitive and hard for her to share sometimes, so I do have it on a podcast, so I'll share that with you after. And if at any time some of the things that we talk about here become heavy, and you feel you need to take care of yourself and you need to leave or come back, please feel free to do that. We want you to have a comfortable space and feel safe here, but also, we understand that the things we may talk about can be really hard for folks to process. So I'm just going to share the Red Women Rising project. So the Red Women Rising project is on our third year with SACUI, and this project started out of just us noticing how, going back to history as a California Indian woman, we know that for our people here in California, we've dealt with relocation, and we've dealt with the gold rush. And because of the gold rush, there was a lot of murder that happened and genocide that happened here in California for our people, especially for our California Indian women. A lot of our women were raped, murdered, and trafficked throughout California. And my reservation, particularly Round Valley, belongs to the Yuki people, but we share that reservation with 6 other tribes, because when colonization happened and folks were taking, say, the land grab, they had pushed a lot of tribes into my reservation, so we shared that, our reservation with other tribes. But during that time, there was a lot of trafficking happening. There was a lot of our children being kidnapped and sold off to folks. And so we know that really dark history of what's happened to our California women. And when we think about what happened during relocation here in California, a lot of our people that came here were looking for more opportunity, a better life, and wanted education, wanted housing. But when they came to California, in cities such as Oakland and San Francisco and Los Angeles, they found that there were no resources for them. And so Native folks had to create their own community here in the Bay Area and in Los Angeles. So during that time too, we talk about the 50th anniversary of Alcatraz, and we talk about how that plays a huge part of our history. It also plays a dark history, which talks about the homelessness of our people that came out here, our students that were involved in the movement and became homeless and became addicted to drugs and alcohol and became missing. So there weren't only women that became missing, there was also men that became missing in our Two-Spirit community. So we know as Native people that there's a history of our people going and becoming missing, but because of the Me Too movement, that has really sparked more attention to domestic violence and sexual assault and trafficking against women. It's really brought a lot of attention to the Native population and our concerns of what's happening, not to mention the violence against the environment and the violence that's happened to the environment from fracking all the way from the United States all the way to First Nation people in Canada. So we know this history of violence, we know this history of how we're related to the land, our relationship to the land and how it ties into us. So as all these things were happening, for Sikuli, we've seen that there wasn't enough resources for our women. We found that, yes, the Me Too movement was happening, but we needed to bring attention to what was happening in urban communities because we've seen that our women didn't have resources, they weren't talking about it, and so that's where the Red Woman Rising Project came out of with Sikuli. So we're like on our going on our 4th year of this project, and this is our website that we created in the 3rd year of the project, just to bring resources to folks and also have it as a teaching tool. So we have this website. We offer this website to our clinics to use while they're training their staff, or we have it for survivors and victims that need resources but are too afraid to come and talk about it or see somebody. Because as we know, our communities are really small. They may go to the clinic and see someone they know and they don't want anyone to know about what's happening to them. So we've created this resource that gives you lots of information, and we also have a media piece to that as well. So I wanted to share with you one of our media components here. We know that everyone is, on digital media, so we decided to create a tool by Ingenuity to give a little bit of history of our experience here in California, and so I'm just going to play that for you.
I think in contemporary Native communities, we do have a lot of Western patriarchal influence that allows for things like rigid women. But also this incredible silence that often exists around violence, domestic violence, and sexual assault. What they say often about the silence around domestic violence is that we as Indian people have to learn to talk about it, to let people who have been victims of it know that there's something wrong with speaking about their experience. If you look at a pre-colonial Native culture, most women did not cover their breasts. And that tells you something very specific about the role of women in this culture. They're not being objectified for their bodies. They are able to exist in a place where they don't cover up, and yet you don't see very high instances of any kind of sexual violence. When you look at the people who are coming in and settling the Americas, they could bring in tons and tons of these soldiers, these men who they say are very uneducated and they're covered in lice and they are unshaven, unclean, and they're like a plundering horde. And what they really equate Native women with is the land itself. And so they feel entitled to the land, they feel entitled to the gold, they feel entitled to the women. For a lot of people, there is still this feeling like we don't have an adequate justice system to address all these issues of colonization. The system is built on settler colonialism. So when you speak up against what's happening to you or to your family, when you talk about it, when you put it out there, you're trusting in the Western justice system to do something about it, and they often won't. It's a majority non-Native people that commit violence against Native people. And when it comes to domestic violence, the statistics say that it's not Native men who are perpetuating violence against Native women.
With domestic violence, a lot of times we forget how important we are. You know, and I feel like when you're in a tribal circle, you're part of a community. And the circle helps people, it helps lift it up, burden off of them. And that in itself is healing. And I feel like being open and vulnerable to share those feelings shows how strong you are. If you could do it, then you're showing another person how to do it too. So it starts with us.
You are a part of something important. You are a part of the community. That community values everything that you are and everything that you're going to do. And you're nominal. So even when somebody comes into your life who wants to make you feel like you are less than, like you are nothing, you know from your core that that is never true. And you are very much valued for who you are as a person in this world.
So this is one of our tools that we use a lot of times with our youth. We've done workshops with them to talk about healthy relationships and just our roles as young men and young women in society and in our community and in our family. And the one thing that when we made this ingenuity video at the time, we did see that there was a high number of women who were being sexually assaulted and abused by non-Native men, but that number has actually changed within the last, I'd say, year and a half, maybe 2 years. And just from the work that we do, we see how when we have, say, new people in new administration and the world, you know, different leadership happens and we see things change in the world and community. And we feel that now, just because of the type of energy that is out there, we're starting to see more of our Native men abusing our women. And so we have been advocating with a lot of other RDV organizations in California. We work with the Strong-Hearted Native Women's Coalition, we work with the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center and the Sovereign Bodies Institute and Intertribal Council of California, and we talk about how do we bring our men back into the circle and how do we bring healing to them. And so that starts a lot with our youth, and this is one of the videos that we share with our youth to get the conversation talking. And if at any time you have any questions, please feel free to interrupt me, raise your hand if a question comes up at any time, like for example with the video.
Are these videos available on your site?
Yeah.
So we can see them anytime?
Yeah, you can see them anytime. I wanted to share with you one of the digital stories, but I will say that because you can go and see, like, we have like 6 of them. So one of the things that we do like to focus on is the digital media, because we feel it's it's important, especially for younger generation, and you can access this website on your phone and hear different stories of women's healing from domestic violence, and so it's really powerful. We also have a timeline, like if you're looking at different, sorry, I'm just trying to navigate on here. This talks about domestic violence movement and highlights things in the timeline here. And this is a great tool, especially for students who are researching issues around domestic violence. You can find a lot of information on, and we highlighted those on here on the timeline. The other thing that I wanted to share with you was some of the policy work that, and I'll just talk about it, that Sikui does. So we do a lot of policy advocacy work around domestic violence. That was like Sikui's main lens, was to work to bring more attention to health disparities for our urban Indians in California. A lot of Native people here, like myself, urban, I'm from Sonoma County, my reservation is in Mendocino, but I'm living and working in an urban community here in San Francisco. I went to school here, and I stayed here. I didn't go back home. I stayed here, and I built my family here, and my career here. And because of that, it doesn't take away from who I am or my connection to home. And so we found that a lot of women were coming into urban communities also to get away from their perpetrators or their abuser. And we decided that we need to have policies in place for them to help protect them. And so we started working with our clinics to look at policies and do you have anything when you're doing intake that protects them or provides services for them, making sure that our clinics have staff that is culturally competent, or if they have a Native clinician to talk to that can help them heal with traditional practices. So looking at those things as well. And on a policy level, looking at billable resources, like how can we bill for traditional services so that folks can decide what types of service they want. So one of the other things, as we looked at trafficking in California, we saw that San Diego has a high number of trafficking happening there. There's 19 reservations down in Southern California. And because of the access to the border and from what I've heard from our partners, the military, a lot of times what happens is young girls are trafficked down in that area because of the military, because of the border. So we have young girls coming across the border and then young girls going across the border. And Sacramento is I think the second highest in California for trafficking as well. And that is another issue too, because of the highways there in Sacramento. There's like how many of us go to Tahoe or take that way going up to Oregon? I know I do on the 5. And so there's others, Reno. So there's, because of the way that the freeways intersect, there's an easy way for young girls to be trafficked, which I was totally shocked about because I wouldn't expect that in Sacramento. But it's also a very rural area, and there's also, I think, gosh, I don't know the exact number, but there's a high population of reservations in that area there. So as we do our work in California on a policy level, we've looked at how do we bring more attention to missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so we've been able to work with state and federal legislation to make change. We're currently working on that now, and we partner with Sovereign Bodies Institute to provide the data that helps support making these policy changes. In San Francisco specifically, we had worked with Supervisor Ronan and Supervisor Valley Brown, who is also Native, and we've been able to pass a resolution for MMIW for May 5th as an official MMIW day. And that was also brought about because we had lost two Native women in our community here in San Francisco. We had lost Veronica Solis, who was an elder in the Tenderloin, and she had been witnessing a domestic violence situation, and when she tried to assist by calling the police and reporting the situation, the perpetrator had stabbed her to death. And so it was very tragic for our community because she was, and I call her a pretty elder, but she was a very important person in the community. The second person was Jessica Alba, who was also murdered by her boyfriend in March, but she died April 6th. And Jessica had 6 children. She was also a community member, and she had come to San Francisco seeking her sobriety, seeking change, to get away from the life on the reservation in Redding. And when she came here, she ended up, creating a better life and, giving her boyfriend at the time another chance. And then he ended up murdering her. The other person was Jessica. That was a student here. Jessica Orozco, yes, was another person. And Jessica Orozco was before Veronica and Jessica Alba. So that took a toll on our community. So within within a year, that was three people that we knew closely in San Francisco. Not to mention, I'll talk about Nicole Smith, who was also murdered, and she's from Puerto Rico, who I knew. So for me, that was like 4 people that I knew that had been murdered. So we saw this change needing to happen as far as like policy. Sukui's also working with the city and county here in San Francisco because of the intake process. Like when the police department gets a phone call and someone says, "Oh, there's a suicide," there needs to be better protocols to making sure that women are protected and that they're asking the right questions. Because with Jessica Alba's case, her abuser called in her case as a murder, as a suicide, but yet it was a murder. So when the police came, they acted as a suicide. They treated it as a suicide. And this happens often with a lot of our women who may have overdosed on opioids, or they'll say they've overdosed on opioids, but yet they could have been given that, or been or maybe being trafficked and being forced to take opioids and drugs and overdose. So we found that also being the case, and we found that not only suicide, any kind of other accident is what it's been called. I know like Bernadette, if she was here today, she would also talk about her other sister who was hit walking on the side of the road, and she says that she believes that she too was murdered. So there's lots of stories we hear within our communities of our women being murdered and gone missing. And so we know that like on a policy level that things need to change to protect them. Sukui's also working on a compendium so that tribes can adopt this document so that they can implement it into, say, their resolutions or policies for, say, their housing, because we found that a lot of our tribes don't have these protections for housing and domestic violence. How do we protect them on and off the reservation? So we've been working with the San Francisco Police Department also and community to create these advisory committees to help the police understand who our community is, really. So that's some of the work that we've been really doing, and we're partnering with Sovereign Bodies Institute to also put out a report for missing and murdered Indigenous women. We're looking at next year to put that out with the compendium. So I do want to also share that Sukui, with our partnership with Sovereign Bodies Institute, is always looking for interns. So if you have an interest in learning more about missing and murdered Indigenous women, or you want to know more about violence against women or violence against people, there's also, trafficking and missing, murdered Indigenous men and boys. So we also do that work too with soccer bodies. So they always come and talk to me about that as well. So, Jackie, did you want to talk about the images that we've created, or do you want Michelle to talk about trauma?
Okay.
And,
I'll go.
okay. Do you want me to pull it up for you?
Yes. I'll stand over here so I can see.
Okay.
Otherwise I'm only talking to you. Here, here's my glass. Slideshow right here.
See, she can see it.
That's because it's on the screen.
It's
like I'm sorry.
Okay.
Okay.
I don't use PowerPoint, so
Yeah, there we go. So we need to stand it through.
is it? Oh, good.
Perfect, perfect. And we'll just get the way with the keys, which one do I push to, down and up?
I think the arrows, yeah.
Arrows, okay.
I also did, I just used the pad.
May I ask a quick question?
Yeah,
What you
definitely.
said? When you mentioned the rise in male native, was that a rise in missing and violence against native males, or was it a rise in the perpetration of violence against native women by native men, or both?
Both, actually both. So, but what I was talking about was the rise in men committing violence, native men committing violence against native women. We've seen a rise in that, but we've also seen a rise when we're looking at missing and murdered Indigenous women. We see that there's a rise in missing and murdered Indigenous men, and that is something that we've been bringing more attention to. And we have a lot of men in our community who do this work that are also working to bring more attention to that.
Yeah.
Because we always get told that, like, don't forget about the men, and we're not forgetting about our men, that we value our men, but right now there's a really big epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women.
Okay, so thank you, April. And April has talked a lot about murdered and missing Indigenous women. And I'm going to talk about how that impacts us as a community and as individuals. So I just want to, I should say I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I provide mental health services at the Native American Health Center, and my specialty is trauma. So if you look at these trees, what is something you notice? Anybody, popcorn style? The roots. And what are the roots doing? They're grasping.
Yeah.
They're not connecting, right? There's no soil. There's nothing for them to connect to there. They're reaching to find it. So I think this is a good example when people have trauma. And as Native people, we are born into complex trauma. I'm going to talk a little bit about that because I don't believe there's any Native person living today that has not experienced historical trauma. And historical trauma is not in history, it's now. So complex, can somebody read that? Can somebody see to read that? I always have turned sideways. Yeah, go ahead.
Complex trauma is typically interpersonal and generally involves situations in which a person who is traumatized cannot escape from the traumatic experiences because he or she is constrained physically, socially, or psychologically.
And this is from Judith Herman. She's one of the experts on trauma in the field of trauma. And complex trauma equates with intergenerational and historical trauma. Complex trauma, as it says, people are constrained either physically by like trafficked women are constrained physically. They're unable to leave. A domestic violence situation. Sometimes people are
constrained physically or psychologically. And socially, if people are living below a poverty level, people are constrained to high-risk crime areas where there's constant trauma and they're exposed to trauma constantly. So this slide I borrowed from Stacey Haynes, who does somatic therapy, and Naz Batam, who I used to work with. And it basically talks about the sites of social shaping. So where we are shaped, different sites, at the individual level, the family level, the community, the society level, and at systems levels. So systems levels are in organizations, in universities, anything that is in organizations or any system that you belong to. So I got ahead of myself and already told you that, but so at the society level, how are we shaped? Through beliefs and norms. The broader society at the time of contact, from the beginning of stepping onto this soil here, created a demonization of Native people. We were invisible. They pushed us away, omitted. They pushed us as far west as they could. They built walls. Wall Street was created to keep the natives out, and it still stands today. There's this idea of the noble savage. We're either pictured with a tomahawk or a weapon, or we're pictured as stoic and regal and standing on a mountainside. At the community, we have a lot of lateral oppression. There's a loss of language. People that during boarding school, the people were not allowed to speak their languages. So next generations didn't get the language. They weren't exposed to it. Some parents didn't teach intentionally. I remember when I came to school here, there was a woman that came in and she said, we were advocating for a language class, and she was saying, no, we don't want to have a language. She came from the generation that it was forbidden to speak your language. Our communities are fragmented. Living in an urban area, as April said, she left an extended family. My extended family is up in Red Cliff in Wisconsin, very distant from here. So we're living in a more nuclear setting in today's world. However, we create extended families for ourselves. We create aunties and we create grandmas, and we are aunties and grandmas. And we adopt each other. There's loss of social roles, as you probably got if you took Indian history, American Indian history here, with Western expansion. The tribes that the sustenance was impacted, so the roles of the men, that they were hunters, they were not able to hunt. You can only hunt a reservation for so long before the game go elsewhere. There's substance abuse, drug abuse, and domestic violence, where we see a lot of the risks of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I put that, the MMIW, on there because that is a form of lateral oppression. As April said, we're finding out there are more Native men that was believed before that are perpetrators in our community. It's time we start acknowledging it and naming it. Because in order to heal something, you have to name it. In order to heal it. You can't heal it if you keep it hidden under the rug. Negativity towards others, you've all heard of the crab in the bucket syndrome, right? One starts to rise, others pull them down. So this is another part of community and lateral oppression. Well, how come it's not going? Okay, down. So historical and intergenerational trauma at the family level. So it's true, not all Native families went to boarding school, but many did. Many lost their language. At boarding school, there were coping mechanisms that were created that people adapted to because that was for survival. As human beings, we're always going to adapt for survival. But as people got older and they kept those coping mechanisms, they became maladaptive, and they no longer served the purpose that they served at one time. Coping mechanisms get transferred to next generations if they're not healed. So if we don't heal from historical trauma, we pass it to the next generation, and the next generation has to heal. Until someone says no more, that's it, and comes into treatment, comes into healing, or finds their healing in another way through culture, many people have done that, then it's going to be passed to the next generation. There's no escaping it. And at the individual level, we learn our behavior from our first teachers. Our first teachers are our parents. And if our parents are struggling with alcohol or substance abuse, that's what we learn. We learn survival. We learn to be caretakers if we must. We learn how to swerve, to navigate, to not get in the way of the verbal bullets that get shot at us from parents that may not believe they're abusive, but have inherited maladaptive coping mechanisms. We also, at the individual, and all of these really, I'm realizing I could have put that on all of them, we are able to, we have within us a resilience to heal. And culture, many of our organizations use culture as healing. Were we going to say something? And MMIW, it impacts, well, of course, if you're the person that's getting trafficked or murdered, it's definitely going to impact you. It's going to impact your family. It's going to impact the community, and that's where April at a larger level has come in with community organization to start, and Sovereign Bodies Institute to start protections against this, and tools that we can be of help. So I talked about how the adaptation to intergenerational trauma was passed from generation to generation. So let's just say, for example, Johnny went to boarding school, and at boarding school there was sexual abuse going on. And Johnny was not sexually abused, but Johnny knew that others were being sexually abused. So Johnny tried to make himself invisible. He made himself as small as he could. He didn't want to be noticed. He didn't speak. He became quiet. And then Johnny goes home. And the family has gatherings and people are coming over. Extended family comes over. Where's Johnny? How come Johnny isn't out here? The parents say, oh, Johnny, he's just in his room. That's just how he is today. Leave him alone. He'll be okay. Maybe he'll come out later. Well, Johnny doesn't come out later. If he does, he comes out momentarily just to grab a plate of food, or someone brings it to him. And his behavior becomes normalized in the family. Johnny gets a girlfriend. Johnny now has kept everything in for so long that his feelings start busting out. They either sizzle out like a bottle. If you put too much in a bottle or a thermos like you have there, it will start leaking out of the side, or it will explode. So Johnny has fits of anger, fits of rage, because all those emotions that he's kept inside are now bursting out. So Johnny's girlfriend tells Johnny's mother, and Johnny's mother says, oh, don't worry, it's just how he is. Just give him room to vent, he'll be okay. Johnny, that behavior is carried to adulthood. They get married, it's normalized in their family. Now the wife is saying it's just how he is, leave him alone, he'll get over it. A new generation is born, and then the next generation is exposed. This here is a big, if you can look at this picture and you feel stress, this is what it feels like when you're carrying complex trauma. This is what it feels like. It's intended to make the viewer feel stressed. I don't know how much time I have to go over. Plenty of time? Okay, so in the outside corners, you'll see many people that experience complex trauma. There will be a somatic numbing, because that's one of their coping mechanisms. So there won't be much feeling. They won't feel a lot. Often I've worked with people that have said, I don't believe in God, I don't believe in Creator, I believe there's something. Well, what's happened is they say, well, I don't see how God could have let, any God or Creator could have let these things that have happened to me happen. And that's a type of a spiritual death. Many people dissociate. There's different levels of dissociation. So, even if, I mean, we all dissociate, it's a normal process. If you're driving your car, you might be listening to music, you might space out, it's how did I get here? You know, and that's a form of dissociation. But some people dissociate when they're in the middle of a trauma because that's their flight, that's their mechanism of fight, flight, or freeze, and they flee through flight process and they mentally leave their body. So and sometimes you'll see that. We'll see that in people if it's stressors become too overbearing to bear, and they will dissociate, and you might just notice a blankness, which they've just left for a moment, and sometimes longer. Dissociative process is also people that we used to call it multiple personality disorder, where different ego states come into the person, and that's in very, very severe cases. There's an emotional masking that takes place. You've heard probably of the person that is the clown in the classroom, the person that smiles on the outside or crying on the inside, the person that you just don't see their emotions. They keep them masked. So then the second layer is this layer that we just went over, the adaptations. The third layer on the inside are some of the things that we see manifested. Difficulty recognizing or expressing emotions, anxiety, guilt, anger, violence, historical unresolved grief, depression, substance abuse, suicide, homophobia, shame, isolation. And by that row is by no means exclusive. I think there's self-destructive behavior down there as well. And then on the inside, you see some of the social impacts that have led to this, like, and that the historical trauma has contributed to. Disease. When you're in a trauma state constantly, there's a release of cortisol and epinephrine in your body. I think I'm saying it right. And that's so that you can fight or flight or flee. And so if you're in a constant state of feeling trauma, that is going through your body all the time. And that is not your friend. That is an enemy. And that leads to cancer, diabetes. I know they're doing studies on it now on how it leads to physical harm. And so I have cancer, TB, there's homophobia up there, displacement, domestic violence, and this is at a tribe or an individual person level. I guess I put an extra slide in there. That's for questions. Anybody have any? Okay, so when we have, these are some of the behaviors that we notice with people that have trauma or complex trauma. If anybody has any questions on how that might manifest, I'm happy to explain. I don't know that I should go through each one, just in the interest of time. Go on to the next one. Defensive self. Sometimes people are very defensive all the time. That's self-explanatory. Disappearing. We learned how, we talked about how Johnny was disappearing, making themselves small so they don't have to be seen. There's a need for perfection. People that have to get everything just perfect. Also a way of caretaking. Because if someone's taking care of everybody else, they don't have to focus on themselves. They don't feel their own symptoms. If you're focused on how bad it is for everybody else and what you have to do for everybody else, you won't feel your own symptoms. Hypervigilant, I talked about that a little bit. Some other symptoms or behaviors that you see. People have problems with boundaries. People let themselves be used. That's similar to boundaries. There's an over-accountability, an need to explain. Some people have no accountability. They just go through and it's like a train wreck happening all over and not accountable for anything.
I think it's interesting to talk about how when you're looking at controlling and you're looking at domestic violence, and how if you've experienced that type of trauma already, then you continue that behavior.
Absolutely, and so another example, like April's saying, if somebody grew up witnessing domestic violence, or they grew up with a parent that was very, very controlling, then they may grow up to mimic that behavior. And they may be carrying, like Johnny in the boarding school, so much pent-up rage inside that that they get into that type of behavior. Very good point, April. Yes.
I have a question about dealing with these domestic violence issues. I'm curious if there is workshops going on within the community, working on relationship units as opposed to working on individual people, but like the interactions between people. Is that something?
We don't offer anything like that right now.
Are you talking about like support groups and things like that for women?
Yeah, well, just how you were saying how men or women could be exposed to these situations growing up in a family and then carrying on or passing on that way. Is there a way that communities can work together and stop those behaviors from continuing in a relationship sense?
Yeah, so like, for example, a lot of the community that come through San Francisco that say may be in treatment at Friendship House, which is our Native Substance Abuse program, a lot of those clients are getting services through the treatment center, but then they're also going to the clinic. So they might go see Michelle Maas, or they may see another clinician who's Native, and they may get individual support in that way, or in that setting they may have groups that work, say their counselor may do work around domestic violence for them. But as far as like the larger community, one of the things that we've seen with all of the missing and murdered women that's happened here in San Francisco is we've seen that the community has really come together and been a voice for the women. They've been organizing politically, going to different rallies that we have for Justice for Jessica. They go to court hearings for example, Veronica's case. Community's been going to that. They've also been gathering together at the health center. Now they have a women's singing group called Red Lightning Women Singers. And that developed out of all of this MMIW work because the community was trying to find a way to heal. And so the women were coming together, they were singing and praying together, and this was part of their healing, and also bringing attention of what's healthy, what's healing for them. And I think that as our men come to these events and these protests, they too are not only supporting the women, but they're also taking care of themselves and what they need to do as well. We've been working with the Dads, I think it's called Dads Network, and Boys with Braids, which is Mike Duncan's group, and then Fifth Direction, which is Calvin Hedrick, and they do a lot of work with men and young boys, and they hold different gatherings around healthy relationships, and they do the Mother and Father Sacred workshops for our Native communities. So we can link you up with any of those gatherings as well. Yeah.
So I want to add to that we don't have a group or services right now where a couple that is having domestic violence matters that they can come together. We don't have that. That would be something great to have. That's one of those things that funding plays a role, and one of the previous slides, we're omitted, and we're omitted statistically, oftentimes by numbers and counts, and that deeply impacts the amount of funding we get. So right now, there's only 2 therapists at the Native American Health Center where I work, a man and a woman. And so it's a matter of resources why we're unable to do that. But like April did say, we do have domestic violence groups at the Friendship House Association of American Indians. If they're clients, in-house, it's a residential treatment program for men and for women that we hold those groups.
I think it's important to also share that, as Michelle was talking about the different types of complex traumas, when we're looking at, say, whether we've experienced domestic violence, whether we have substance abuse, whether we have depression, a lot of those things are usually tied together and they overlap together. And so what we found is that when we have community gatherings, say, that are bringing healing to the community, it's healing for all of those things. So it's not just focused on one thing. Is kind of how I see it. Like when we do the water walk.
Right, and I think that that's one of the ways that as Native people we see healing. I think the Western way, everything is compartmentalized. And life doesn't happen in compartments, it happens with whole persons and whole people, right? So I think that that's one of the considerations when we do work is that we consider the whole person, and when we're doing community events, it covers a lot of areas, it's healing in many, many areas. Okay, so these are some of the skills that are missing or that don't develop. Connections, remember the tree in the beginning, those 2 trees? They were missing connecting, their roots were dangling. They were striving to connect somewhere, but they were unable to get rooted. And this we find in people also. People are looking for connection because we all want to belong. It's we're social creatures, so we all want to belong somewhere. So connections, when people have experienced trauma or multiple traumas, complex traumas, it's difficult for them to connect because their trust has been broken, and trust has been broken regardless of whether someone's native, perpetrator's native or not. When trust is broken, trust is broken. Ability to choose, some people have a hard time making choices. They need help in their choices. Ability to say yes or no in decision, that's something else that we see that's, if people have experienced a lot of trauma, they have a problem to do that. A lot of lack of ability to experience a wide range of emotion. On one of the screeners for PTSD, that's one of the questions, inability to feel love or happiness. And oftentimes you'll see people that have experienced trauma or complex trauma staying right in the middle, kind of a flat zone in the middle. People, we all heard Mick Jagger say, "I can't get no satisfaction," but that's one of the people don't feel satisfied. Belonging, I talked about. Acceptance. Creativity. Creativity is a strange thing because while many people, that's their medicine, they can be creative and if they've experienced trauma or complex trauma, and that's their medicine. I mean, they just fully get absorbed with that, with the creative piece. Some people feel blocked from trauma, and they feel they're so busy in hypervigilant state that they can't get to that part of creativity. And we all have some part of us that is creative. Well, I have a lot of these up here. I didn't know I had so many. People that have experienced a lot of trauma will have problems using their voice for positive for themselves. They will be the first ones if something is, if someone else is dissed or done wrong to, they will be the first one talking the loudest about what happened to someone else. But oftentimes it's hard for them to speak up for themselves. Not always, not everybody. None of these are absolute. Feeling worthy. When we have a trauma or multiple traumas, there's a negative belief that is internalized. When the trauma gets stuck within us, there's a negative belief about ourselves that gets stuck as well. And that's how the therapeutic process works, is we find that negative belief and attach it to the physical to move through it. Being with contradiction, some people with severe trauma will see one side or the other. They won't be able to see the middle of the road. Things are either black or things are white. Containment, some people can't keep their emotions contained. Their emotional regulations is challenged. Connecting with their bodies. I've worked with several women that have had sexual assault or sexual molestation, and they tell me they don't feel from the waist down. They don't feel. And taking a stand, and by that I mean a healthy stand. Oops. So when we do the work with people that have experienced trauma, when I work with people, whether it's at an individual or a group level, the first thing is safety. People have to feel safe, so I work to develop a trust and have them feel safe. Internal boundaries. How are they on the inside? Do they feel safe in my office? So we don't want to jump into talking about trauma right away. We want to make them feel welcome. Just kind of follow the flow of the conversation. I won't let someone go into all of their trauma on the first visit as well, which is sometimes people want to do that because that can have a tendency to overexpose. External boundaries. Sometimes people, as I mentioned, have problems with setting boundaries, how far one can come into their personal space. And I've had a group where I've had women that had absolutely no boundaries at all. And I could walk right up on them, and they didn't tell me to stop. It was an exercise of, tell somebody to stop when they're in their personal space. Emotional regulations, managing the symptoms, that's what we want to do. So we do some interventions to help them manage the symptoms and emotionally regulate. Then we'll get into the story. Now they may want to tell the story. Oftentimes people want to tell the story right away. And we will let people tell a big picture view of the story, and then as we get into the treatment, they can tell more details of the story. And then, as I said, we want to find the negative belief about themselves. Then what we do is we assist the person to reframe that negative belief. And that's creating a new story and how they see the trauma. The trauma will never, the incident will never go away because we can't change what's happened in the past, but we can change how people feel about it and how they feel about themselves, and that's the part of integration. So I'd like to read this because I have this hanging in my office. We are living this comes from Ben Okri, who is a Nigerian storyteller, and it's in the book, The Truth About Stories by Thomas King. We are living the stories planted in us early or along the way, or we are also living the stories we planted, knowingly or unknowingly, in ourselves. We live stories that either give our lives meaning or negate it with meaninglessness. If we change the stories we live by, quite possibly we change our lives. And that's my friend. So I'll take any questions, if anybody has any questions about anything I said. Yeah.
What was your educational path to get to this point where you are now?
I came here and I was been a parent student at one time. And I'll tell a quick story because I know we're running out of time, but I was a high school dropout. I dropped out of school in the 10th grade, and it didn't end up on a straight and narrow path. Took a lot of dark turns in my early life. And I was at bingo one day, and there was a lady sitting across from me, and she was telling me she was going to school, and I was like, how can you afford to go to school? Because to me it was like, you have to have big butts to be able to go to school. And she said, oh girl, they give you money to go to school, and I was like, really? And that's how I found my way over to City College, and then I came over here and I met Dr. Parent, and the rest is history. And I spent a lot of time here. Probably could have had a PhD many years as I spent here. And then got hired at the Native American Health Center and pursued my hours, and I'm now licensed as a licensed clinical therapist. I was initially planning on being a professor. that's where my goal was going. I was going to go do a graduate degree, but I had a friend who was in the Bachelor's of Social Work department and said, well, what are you going to do when we graduate? We're both graduating at the same time. I said, I'm going to get a degree in ethnic studies. And she said, come to me with social work. Come to me and do social work. And so, you know, I said, I don't have no experience in social work. She said, but you have life experience, and that's what they're looking for. So I went, and I was accepted, and the rest is history. So thank you all. You've been great. Appreciate it.
So, again, like I said, Bernadette was not able to come today, and but she really wanted me to share her story of her sister Nicole. So this is a podcast that was recorded through Sovereign Bodies Institute, one of our partners. And so you'll hear in the very beginning of the podcast some data around missing and murdered Indigenous women. And you can also find this podcast, it's on, I think, KPFA, under, it was broadcasted for, I think it was National Women's Day, I think it was. But I'm going to play it for you. It is really heavy, I want to warn you. It's a pretty heavy story because it's Bernadette's story of the night that Nicole was murdered. So I just want to share that in case that you feel you need to, you know, take care of yourself. But I wanted to share that with you, and then if you have any questions around the podcast, I can answer those, and then we'll have Jackie share some of the images, because her images are so powerful and beautiful, and I don't want to end on a sad note. Taylor's going to help me. Mateo is my neighbor at TCC downtown, so we know each other very well.
Is a piece by Sara Blanco and Morningstar Gabi.
This is Nicole.
Invisible epidemic, missing and murdered Indigenous women in California and beyond. 2019 is the year of the woman, and we celebrate all of the positive and revolutionary changes that are happening. We'll be addressing the fight back against gender and sexual violence, specifically by paying our respects toward all Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit peoples who have gone missing or have been murdered. They're affected by these terrible crimes in disproportionate numbers across the United States and Canada and beyond, and at alarming rates in California. Yet this epidemic seems invisible. Today we share stories of people trying to end these crimes. This is a collaboration between Morningstar Golly, Hit River Tribal member, Sovereign Bodies Institute board member, and myself, Sara Blanco, Mexicana, Chicana, and ally. Note, we'll be referring respectfully to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls as MMIWG or MMIW interchangeably. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention listed murder as the third leading cause of death among American Indian and Alaska Native women. According to the National Crime Information Center, 5,712 cases of Native women were reported missing in 2016 alone, but only 116 of them were logged in the Federal Missing Persons Database. But it isn't always public information, and it seems to me that passionate researchers have to start at square zero, work backwards. Identifying cases they can corroborate. Plus, like Sovereign Bodies Institute, known as SBI, they're checking to see what governmental and local police data actually exist. We will recite a lot of statistics throughout, and I'm the first to admit that beyond the heinousness and the sadness that I feel, there's also a lot of confusion. My point is that all this data is just the beginning of what is known, but the following exponential rates seen in California alone are alarming.
Traditional songs and dances that I have been lucky enough to be raised in strongly. So I totally give all credit to the Creator for giving us these songs and dances to help me be strong for my children and for my parents, and to not hold any negative feelings toward my people who threw me out, because of what happened. So I definitely understand that our songs are very powerful and our dances are very powerful, and I've been able to continue on doing and practicing those things because of my faith in our practices and in our traditional ways.
You just listened to a prayer by Bernadette Smith with Clarence Carrillo. We wish to thank Bernadette Smith and her loved ones for the testimony and the bravery. Wishing you healing and peace, Bernadette. Earlier we
So, that story is really, really heavy, and it's really hard to listen to. I mean, every time I hear it, I've known Bernadette since she was little. Nicole, I didn't really know that well because she was a lot younger than me, but I knew her older sisters. So, just to see the family go through that, and how it's affected our community is really tragic. And when that happened, Bernadette did reach out to Sakui to ask, like, what can, you guys do, or give me information about, like, how to protect me, because she was getting kicked out of her home. And that's what really helped us think about policies around protecting our families when they're on the reservation or in urban communities around housing, because even though there are housing protections in, say, San Francisco, they don't apply to our people on the reservation. So, that's one of the things that I started thinking about it, because there was policies within her tribe around domestic violence, but it was more like if you're involved in a domestic violence case, then like you're out, you lose your house and you lose your housing. And we know that that's not taking care of our people. So I think that it's beautiful to know that even though this has happened to Bernadette and Nicole and Yolanda and Natalie, all the sisters, that they still are there on the reservation, they still go to roundhouse, they still practice ceremony. Like, it hasn't made them feel bad about their people or their home. They still go there, they're still involved. But those are the reasons why the policies need to change. And I think just to give our leaders the benefit of the doubt of they really don't understand what's happening to our women. There's so many things as tribal leaders that are happening on the reservation. There's other issues that take priority over, say, a case that, we know that we see that in our own communities of being overloaded with things to do. But I think that we have to bring more attention to our tribal leaders about this issue and how important it is. And so I think that now they've been learning more about it as we've been presenting to our tribal judges now with our ICWA workers and city and county folks that have reached out to us to share the work that we do around domestic violence and MMIW. So thank you for listening to that. I really appreciate it. And I wanted to end with Jackie, Jackie Fawn. She's our amazing artist, and she's rebranded a lot of our Red Women Rising work. And so she's going to talk about the beautiful images that she's created for the rock. this other one. Okay, excellent.
Okay.
So Jackie, right there.
I'm tablet, so this is weird. Hi everyone, I'm Jackie Fawn. Make it real quick because I know we pressed for time, but it's a real honor to work for Sikui because most of my main work is through environmentalism and on the front line, so I do a lot of work. All my art really focuses on like different environmental campaigns, like against pipelines, against fracking, just pretty much all oil industry. And lately, working with April, and before, like there was a few moments where I did talk about like mental health issues, for, like our suicide youth issue that's going on in our res, and to work with April to take that background of environmentalism and to reach further back into like, because on the front lines you realize that there is a lot of warriors that do come out, and as Native folk, like we have a big tie to the land, but in that tie, like, you know, we come out to these front lines hurting, like it's not fair, but you know, we don't have a choice. Like we take our traumas with us to the front lines, because like back home it's hard to deal with it, but on the front lines we meet our warriors. So to do this work, it's real healing for me as well, to like reach back and like figure out what my problems are and to like share that with others so they can like have that representation. Because that's one thing we really lack on is representation in all things. Like this image was real important for me in Red Woman Rising, because in like almost all media that you see in Hollywood, there's never real healthy relationships for Native women or Native men. It's either a Native man with a white woman or a Native woman with a white man, and those are the only representations of healthy relationships. Like the only Native couple I've really seen that was like big was in Twilight, and he like clawed the shit out of her, excuse my language, clawed her face up. So that wasn't cool. So this image to me was like, how do you bring those people on both sides that have hurt each other into like a circle and like get that healing. So you know, we need each other. So that was like a real important image to me, especially because like I came out of a relationship and had this job with April, so it was real healing for me to do this series. And like this one was to talk about that relationship with your elders, like how do we bring that connection back with our elders and like find our roots, because not only are we hurting, our elders are hurting too, because they were young too at one point and they had those traumas that never went away. So this was like to talk about like how we can come together and break those barriers. And this was also to talk about that too, because like we don't really talk about elder abuse. Like that's a big thing that happens a lot in Indian country, which is sad. We uphold our elders, we talk about them as grandmas and grandfathers, but here we are in a cycle that's like never ending, and it's like it's the youth hurting our elders, and like how do we end that and like come together in a good way again and like fix our circles. And this is the Red Woman Rising image that we used for the campaign, is like so the logo is like a woman rising out of a poppy flower, and this is like a version of that, of how as like urban women, like how do we rise from the concrete that's put over our earth, and like where do we find those spaces to get our healing when we're so pushed away from each other, and it's hard to find one another in the city. So like this image was to represent like us growing out of that and like rising with our traumas like from that, and like finding the support, like those hands are like watering this girl, because it's like we need each other, you know, we're never going to heal alone. So that's what this story, this series is for the Red Woman Rising campaign. I don't know if anyone got
that. Really beautiful work. And when I first saw that image, you know, right, it's also right here. It reminded me of the Kalo, the Kanaka Maoli, the Native Hawaiian concept of their people coming from the Kalo plant. It just kind of brought that to me. But especially being, you know, in an urban space, at least right now, I see this, and any of you can speak to this, but you see the potential of working with other Indigenous peoples around the world, not just in the United States, in terms of this issue of the violence against women. There was a radio program, I think it was on NPR a while back, and I think the woman was Danae. And I was surprised because it was, at least it was showing, I mean, I know it's NPR, it's not like CNN,
Yeah.
but at least it was on something. And it was such an epidemic, you know, in her space. You know, I'm just kind of battling at this point, but
Yeah.
you see, because
No,
like
that's
that image,
true.
even though it's very specific for you as an artist, it reaches out. It's universal.
So that's one thing I also focus on too, is that inclusivity and like being able to represent like our people, like to be inclusive as well. So I don't try to like, a lot of my art, I don't stick to a lot of like hard details or like regalia, but just like more like our modern influences, like our ribbon skirt, the red dress, like that goes to like, that's like for a lot of all of us. But I do like other like nations too, because I'm also Filipino, so I do have like my connections with my Asian roots, my Pacific Islander roots, and have a few campaign posters on that as well.
Cool.
That's pretty much whoever asked me, but and like have to do that research.
I think that's what's so beautiful about Jackie's art is that it tells a story, you know, like the way she interprets it, each individual art piece, she tells it her way, but we all have our own story when we see it. Like you were saying, when I seen that, I thought of this, and that's what makes it so powerful. And I think that as we've been sharing her work in other communities, we see that, like, say folks from the Filipino community, folks from Indigenous communities in Central and South America can relate to that art as well and feel connected. Or it's not just California Indian women, it's all intertribal. So I think that that's what's so beautiful about it, because we all have those intersections of violence, you know, in our relationship to the land, violence against us as women. So we see that. So I think that's what makes her images so powerful.
I want to give a real shout out to the panel. This is very emotional for me because even if Michelle didn't become a professor, she started and continues to start and manages programs that, believe it or not, professors, just like everybody else, can get old and need services. And I go now for the services that she provides, so that it feels like a circle has been made. And we're not exactly neighbors. She's her people are from the Midwest, and I'm from Alaska. So, but you know, in a way, the whole relocation thing was to get rid of us. It didn't. It just didn't. And I'm so proud of the panel. I just think it's absolutely fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you, Betty. Michelle's one of my teachers. That's why when she was saying that up there, when she's like, I wanted to be a professor, I'm like, you aren't a professor. Because she's taught me so much just working with her at the health center and doing this community work. She's so valuable. So I'm always
in a lot of communities, there'll be the health centers, the Indian things, and maybe a university over here, and factories or whatever, and military something or other, and the Indians just kind of aren't a part of things. But when we're all here, people, you know, the art exhibit downtown, everybody's carrying on. Where did all these people come from? Well, you just didn't see them.
Right.
You just didn't see them. That's the deal.
Yeah, Indians looking at Indians.
So I'm curious about what you suggest in terms of like action items. Like, these issues feel really heavy, and also can feel like what can be done about them. And so I'm curious for any of y'all on the panel what your thoughts are about potentially plugging in the work that y'all are doing.
I think that one of the things I mentioned earlier was that the Me Too movement really sparked, you know, this attention to MMIW. So I think that like for us, it's like, don't forget about us. You know, don't forget our women, don't forget say their names is what we always say about our missing and murdered Indigenous women, because we have permission to say their names from these families, and because we don't want to forget them, we want to find them, we want to know that like their memory their spirit's always with us. For those that have been murdered, like Jessica, she's always with us. When we were at the rally, we saw butterflies around when we were singing and talking about her. So we just always say like action items for us, like for Sikui, what our action items are just making sure that there's policies on a state and federal level that apply to us, because like for California, we're a public law 280 state, so like Savannah's Act and certain acts don't apply to us. So making sure that we go back to Congress and say, hey, you know what, these legislative policies are great, but they don't help us. So making sure that we look at the language and that we get support from our local government, state and federal government. And so those are some of the things that Sikui is doing, is just really working with our police department to bring more attention to our community, and doing cultural humility training with the police force to make sure that, kind of like Betty was saying, we have this exhibit with all Native faces on it, and people were like, oh, I didn't know they were Native. And it's like, because we look just like, everyone else. We're not always wearing regalia. We're not always, looking like this stoic Indian, or, of these stereotypes. So I think that we just continue to bring attention to missing and murdered Indigenous women.
And I think that there's a strong correlation in how we treat the land and how we treat women. And in our community, the earth is our mother. And if you look at what's happening to the land all over the world, really, it's being desecrated, it's being raped. And that's exactly what's happening with our women. So I think having a voice, if the question, I'm going to extend it a little further, what can I do to speak up, to write your Congress people, because how we look at women is the same as how people are looking at the earth as commodities, is how women are seen, particularly where these big pipelines are going. Up in North Dakota was against Enbridge, I think, and now up in the Midwest around the Great Lakes, there's a big fight. One of my reservations voted no Enbridge, so they're looking now to reroute their pipeline into neighboring counties, because they can't go through our reservation. They're old pipelines, they gotta move them. And so I think having a voice against these big, big monsters is really what they are.
I'd say supporting the people that are already doing the work, that's really big. Like, we have a lot of women out there, especially on the front lines. Like, check in on the women on the front lines. Like, Conahu's Manuel, she's one of the Northern Sisters, and she just got abused by police officers. They broke her wrist, and she's standing in the direct line of the pipeline building, and she fights man camps. Man camps are one of the big things, like calling them out and like letting people know that these man camps where oil workers work are one of like a big trafficking site. And just checking in on community, like showing up to vigils. Like, that's one of our biggest things, like showing up is one of the biggest part, like that's most of the work is just showing up. Because we do hold, there are searches, like searches for women, like getting people out there and trained how to do your, being self-sufficient, trained in how to do search trainings. Like, how do you go find someone that's missing? They hold workshops like that. Anita, yeah? With SBI, like, they will hold trainings, like, if you ask, reach out, like, how to get those resources and share that knowledge.
I saw a really cool video of a community, I don't remember the exact location, but they did these midnight medicine walks, where they went on these high traffic sites as an entire community and stopped where these women were at and gave them an opportunity to smudge and sing to them and just be there and tell them that we're there for you, and like if they did need help, they had a whole community to like seek help from, and it was always at like midnight, like at late night instead, like during the day. Is there anything we do like in San
Francisco that we could do something like that, or?
Well, I think resources again is a great idea. I think resources is key in getting, there's a lot of, as Fawn said, there's a lot of women on the front lines, but you can only spend your energy so far. And I think the place you're talking about is up in northern Minnesota in Duluth. That's where they did that. Yeah.
And to answer on that, like to do those kind of things, that's self-organizing, you know?
Yes.
If you have that idea, act on it. That's like one of the first things, like, we all have great ideas, but we're all strapped for time and bodies. So the more people that get ideas, act on them, reach out to people like, hey, I have this idea, let's organize. So that's one of the, like, pressing things, just organize, and organize.
Yeah, just like even with the Red Lightning Women Singers, they've been asked to sing a lot at funerals and, in celebrations, and people reach out to a lot of us that are doing this work to come and pray with them, to come and just show up for their family and just be with them. So those are the things that we have to do privately for families. I know, like for Jessica's family, they were coming down from Pitt River constantly, and we were trying to find ways for that to pay for their gas or to pay for parking. Just to show up at an event in San Francisco, parking's like, like $20 an hour. Yeah. But thank you. That's a great idea.
Okay, just a couple more, go ahead.
One last question. I heard you guys mention about the Two-Spirit community, and I'm just curious if there is more work towards that and representation of it.
So with that, we do have a Two-Spirit community, but we're really spread out right now. A lot of us, we just reach out online. Facebook is one of our biggest friends. But, we do have events, like we do have a Two-Spirit powwow. There are conferences, and it's pretty hard because we're pretty spread out. But we do, like, when we do find each other, we do try to, like, just always stay in contact and link up and find out how we can support each other. And right now I feel like, I'm sorry, what was the question again about the Spirit communities?
Just their involvement and their presence in this movement, and like
Oh yeah, for the MMI and W2 Spirit. Yeah, so I can't speak on a lot, but we, like in my personal circle, we do support each other in that, because I have a lot of relatives that do live on the East Coast in Northern Canada. So the best way I can personally say how I support is reach out to them and offer like support and fundraising, because that's one of the biggest things, like they were saying, is resources. Like offer up fundraising skills, offer up your platforms. Like if you like have a great social media following, or just like any kind of platform in the community and like with youth, uplift them. That's like the biggest you can do is uplift. Because I feel like one of the biggest reasons like we're so at risk is because we're so outcasted. In my hometown, the biggest population is our queer youth. Like that's not fair. We get outcasted because we're like, hey, this is who I am. So just offering and like the outreach and that before they go missing, that's like the biggest tactic you want to do is like reach them before they go missing.
And then Sovereign Bodies Institute is doing a lot of work around bringing more attention to our trans women who, there is a high percentage of missing and murdered trans women. And the violence that's happened against trans women, not only I'll say here, out in the community, but also in incarceration. If you have women who are incarcerated, their lives are threatened, and so there needs to be protections for them as well. So I know that the number has increased for trans women, for Native trans women.
Well, thank you so much for your time and perspective and education of us on these issues. And we'll let you break.
Thank you guys
Thank
for
you
having
us.
hard.
Appreciate it.